Are you looking to increase your range of motion or mobility? What is the best way to stretch? Is it a static stretch and hold? Is it dynamic stretching? Is it an assisted stretch? How long should you hold each stretch for? 5 seconds? 10 seconds? 30? A minute? How many days a week should you stretch? How intense should each stretch be? If you do an internet search on all of these ideas, you're going to get a wide variety of answers. I mean, you might as well ask like, should pineapple belong on pizza? Or should toilet paper roll up, over, or under? Like, you're just not going to get many straightforward answers on stretching. So I've spent a lot of time going through all the research to put it all together in this video for you to present to you what is the best way to stretch. Okay, so the purpose of this video is to take a critical and hopefully unbiased appraisal of the scientific literature. What is the best way to stretch? So we're going to be taking a look at the optimal type of stretching, the optimal duration that you should hold each stretch for, the optimal time per week to spend stretching, the optimal frequency of stretching, the optimal intensity of each stretch. And then next week, I'm going to flip the script back on you and I'm going to ask you a question. Why are you stretching? In other words, what's the point? What are you doing it for? And that may seem like a provocative question, but we're going to take a look at the research for why do you want to stretch? Now, what I'm going to be trying to do in this particular video is not cherry pick different studies that may fit my bias. We're going to use primarily studies that are called meta-analysis and systematic reviews. And if you're not familiar with those terms, they're types of research publications that take into account all the available studies and compile the results and come up with a conclusion based on all the results and data from those previous studies. And by using systematic reviews and meta-analysis, as I said, I think it avoids me cherry picking studies that might fit my bias. All right, so let's start at the top. What is the optimal way to stretch? The optimal type of stretching, and that could include, static stretching where you stretch and hold. Could be a contract and relax type of stretch, otherwise known as proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation, or PNF. And let's be honest, if a fancy name like that doesn't evoke a placebo effect, I don't know what will. You can have assisted stretching, dynamic stretching, foam rolling, strengthening, just all of these different types of stretching, right? So let's look at the first study here. The best and most recent meta-analysis on this topic was pretty much equivocal. There seems to be no consistent clarity on whether there is a superior form of stretching to produce acute changes in range of motion. All right, so we've already established, according to a meta-analysis that looked at all the studies, doesn't really seem to be one way that's superior to the other. And you could be critical of that study. You can see it in the title. It has to do with the acute effects of stretching. In other words, if you stretch, what is the immediate effects on range of motion and mobility, right? But what about if you chronically stretch? What if you stretch over and over and over again over the period of months or years, right? What's going to happen? What is the best type of stretching for that? So this paper by Conrad in 2024 looked at the studies comparing foam rolling to static stretching and concluded that if studies only looked at the effects up to 4 weeks, foam rolling was ineffective compared to static stretching. But if the studies looked at the effects beyond 4 weeks, there was no difference between foam rolling and static stretching. This paper compared static stretching to PNF and again concluded there was no difference. They said that static stretching and PNF stretching were both equally effective in the short term and long term. So look, I'm not going to bore you with all of these different studies. It could go on and on forever. Really, the conclusion is there's really not much difference between the type of stretch. Whatever stretch you want to do, great, just stick with it. But there's one thing that I want to talk about that isn't typically associated with stretching to improve range of motion, and that's weight training or strengthening. The studies are pretty clear that strengthening seems to be just as effective as stretching when it comes to improving range of motion. So this systematic review in 2021 looked at 11 different studies that compared one group doing strengthening and the other group doing stretching and concluded that both groups increased range of motion, but there was no difference between the strengthening and stretching group in the short term or long term. However, they do mention that there's added benefits to strengthening beyond just range of motion that you don't get with just stretching, such as greater improvements in strength, injury prevention, and performance gains. So my opinion on that is, look, if you're going to spend the time trying to improve your range of motion, why not do it with strength training? so that you can get the added benefits of injury prevention and strength and all the rest of that, while also increasing range of motion. All right, so that's type of stretching. We're gonna move through these next sections significantly quicker. So let's take a look at the second question. What is the optimal duration to hold a stretch for? And the answer to this question was best answered in this paper published in the Journal of Orthopedic and Sports Physical Therapy, where they reviewed 28 different studies and found that a stretch of 30 seconds was better than a short duration stretch, but anything longer than 30 seconds didn't really seem to have much of an effect. However, they do go on to say that stretching for shorter duration with multiple sets is just as effective. So in other words, if you're gonna do a stretch for 10 seconds, let's say, and you do 3 of them, right? That'll be a total of 30 seconds. That would be just as effective as a 30-second stretch, right? It's the total amount that seems to matter more. But going beyond 30 seconds doesn't really seem to have much more of a benefit. And this was reiterated in a 2023 paper that looked at 47 different studies, and they reported that stretching performed with shorter duration but multiple repetitions had similar gains in range of motion, and they concluded there is no single duration that provides a significant range of motion gain advantage. So in other words, it's not really about how long you hold each stretch for, it's the cumulative time. And that brings us to our next topic, which is what is the optimal time per week that you should spend stretching to get the most gains? And for the answer to that question, Thomas and colleagues come to our rescue with their paper in 2018. They looked at 23 different studies and they found that it isn't so much about the time spent in each session as it is about the total time spent per week. And as a bonus, they provide us with some nice bar graphs to look at. So they give us this nice, easy to understand graph that shows if you spend less than 5 minutes per week stretching, you won't see as much improvement in range of motion compared to if you did between 5 and 10 minutes stretching for the week. Anything beyond that seems to be just a waste of time. So if we were to put that in practical terms, let's say you wanted to stretch your hamstring, let's say, right? So let's say you do it for 30 seconds and you do it 3 times, that's 1.5 minutes total. And if you do that 6 days a week, 6 days times 1.5 is 9 minutes total for the week. That would fall in that nice little Goldilocks area that Thomas and colleagues found seems to be the optimal amount of time per week for stretching. Now, I just threw out 6 days a week, right? But that brings us to our next question, or answer to the question, what is the optimal frequency of stretching per week? And for the answer to that, we can go to the same paper with another very easy to understand graph to look at. So you can see here that 4 days seems to be better than 2 days, and 6 days seem to be better than 4 days, and doing it 7 days a week seems to be a waste of time. So some examples here, again, like the one that I just gave, holding a 30-second stretch for 3 repetitions, 6 days a week would be 9 minutes total for the week. Alternatively, holding 15-second stretch for 6 repetitions, 6 days a week should give you the same results. Holding a 10-second stretch for 9 repetitions, 6 days a week, again, should give you the same results, and so on and so on. All right, so now we're getting somewhere, right? We figured out the optimal type of stretch, which there really doesn't seem to be one, the optimal duration for stretching, the optimal times per week for stretching, the optimal amount of time per week for stretching, and now we're gonna move on to intensity. When you're doing a stretch, how intense should that stretch be? And for the answer for that, we're gonna turn to this 2021 paper by Fukiya, who found that about half the studies say that there's more gains with a more intense stretch, but when looking at passive stiffness, 5 studies showed higher intensity is more effective, but 3 did not. And they concluded that a more intense stretch may be more effective in the short term, but not in the long term. And another review topic in 2023 looked at 33 different studies that tested the results of stretching intensely or not, and found that there was no significant association between intensity and gains of range of motion compared to moderate intensity, and also cautioned about the risks of injury with more intense stretching. Alrighty then, so with all of that covered, all of these meta-analysis and systematic reviews that we looked at, it seems like the type of stretch, the optimal type of stretch, whether it's static or dynamic or foam rolling or PNF or whatever, doesn't really seem to matter that much. What matters more is the cumulative time that you're doing stretching, right? So as far as the duration of each particular stretch, you don't generally want to go over 30 seconds. It seems to be a bit of a waste of time, but you want to be stretching for about 5 to 10 minutes per week and doing it about 5 or 6 days a week. So back to that example, If you do a 30-second stretch on a body part 3 times in a session, you've got a minute and a half worth of stretching right there. You do that 6 days a week, you're in the 9 minutes total per week, which seems to be the Goldilocks area for improving mobility. Now, as Deep Thought said in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, that is the answer, but maybe we're not asking the right question. Maybe we don't know what the question is. And my question to you next week is going to be, why? Why are you stretching? And I mean that honestly. What is the point? So we're going to cover that next week.